In the fight against COVID-19, testing offers another layer of protection in addition to vaccines. Go to vdh.virginia.gov and search by zip code to find a free COVID-19 test near you. A message from your Virginia Department of Health.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeff Fan. Welcome back this week to This Week in the ACC, the podcast of allsportsdiscussion.com, the longest-running independent ACC podcast in the country. You can follow me at Twitter at TalkinACCSports. Matthew, our normal moderator, who has moderated the last 376 podcasts, is on vacation this week in northwest central Minnesota. You can follow Matthew on Twitter at HokiesMash_ASD. Our guest host tonight is Clemson alumnus James Bostic, who you can follow on Twitter at Cubosco, CUBOSCO. So yes, we totally planned this because we have two Clemson alums. Myself and James are Clemson alums, are hosting tonight's podcast as we preview the 2021 Clemson football team. Tonight we have a great return guest in Scott Reimer, who you can follow on Twitter at Tiger Pregame. I've listened to this show many times on my way to Clemson, and he does a great job. He joins us by way of tigerpregameshow.blogspot.com. He hosts the Tiger Pregame Show on WCCP 105.5 FM in the upstate of South Carolina. So I'm going to turn it over to James, my co-host for the evening, as he starts the podcast with the first questions for Scott.
Yeah, thanks. Before we get started, just tell us more about yourself, Scott, and plug in anything you want here.
Well, thanks, James and Jeff. It's great to be back on here. This has kind of turned into a yearly ritual, and I think it kind of gets me centered for football season when I get the call to come on. So appreciate that. And Jeff, you hit on most of the highlights. I host the Tiger Pregame Show on WCCP 105.5 FM. That's based out of Clemson, South Carolina. But, of course, now with the Internet and live streaming, you can get it anywhere in the world. It's WCCPFM.com. I've hosted that show since 2003. And when the Tigers and the Bulldogs kick things off in Charlotte in a couple of weeks, it'll be our 243rd edition of the Tiger Pregame Show. You mentioned the blog spot and Twitter, also the Tiger Pregame Show on Facebook. I also have cranked up the YouTube version of the Tiger Pregame Show, do a little Instagram as well. That's Tiger Pregame Show, and I'm trying to keep young with the young folks. We do the TikTok as well. It's Tiger Pregame Show at TikTok, and I would just mention it's really just all of the different social media accounts all do the same thing, and that is to give out a historical look at Clemson athletics, Clemson University, certainly Clemson football. There's a picture of the day that goes out every day during the off season, which we call dark territory, when there's no Clemson athletics going on, whether that's football, basketball, baseball, a dark territory letterman of the day. And all that goes out daily. And then, of course, so once we kick into football season, all the information regarding the Tiger Pregame Show. But all of it's done just to promote Clemson and the history of Clemson for the young folks out there who I know James and I come from a little bit different generation and don't know all the history of Clemson, some of these young guys and gals that come through the university now. So that's kind of the idea is to keep people informed of what Clemson was and the greatness of this university and certainly the athletic programs as well. So glad to be on and glad to talk a little Clemson football tonight, James.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time of the year, especially after we've all we've been through in the last year and a half. So let's get going. What are some of the major strengths coming back for the Tigers this year?
Well, I think when you talk strengths for Clemson, I think it starts really at the quarterback position, which in college football and probably the NFL as well, but certainly in college football is the defining factor of championship football versus, otherwise. And, you've got to have a great guy behind center. Of course, they don't really get under center anymore from the shotgun, but Clemson certainly has that. And DJ Uiagalelei, the former 5-star and number 1 rated quarterback coming out of high school, had kind of a wonky year because he didn't have a spring last year, a traditional spring, because of COVID and all of the shutdown, but came in and really was called on to really win a very pivotal game for Clemson against Boston College, and of course lost the game up in South Bend, but played very well in that game. And in his time on the field, DJ was exceptional. He's a big body, 6'4", a little over 250 pounds. He threw for 914 yards, 5 touchdowns, didn't have an interception. He did play in 10 games, which, you wouldn't necessarily think about because of Trevor Lawrence and of course, his dominance as Clemson starter. But Clemson, most of the games got out of hand, or a lot of the games got out of hand. It allowed DJ to play. So he's certainly a strength. I mean, I don't, there is really no quarterback probably in the country that that returns this year with the ranking, if you will, of that recruiting and the physical piece to it, with a little bit of game experience. There's very few quarterbacks that bring all that to the table. So DJ Uiagalelei is certainly one of Clemson's strengths. He's also, I think, and this will kind of hit on my one of the weaknesses of Clemson here when we talk a little bit later, is he brings a different dimension to the quarterback position than Trevor Lawrence. People often talked about Trevor's ability to run the football and his elusiveness. Of course, he had that big touchdown against Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl a couple of years ago. Certainly was capable of running the football, but Clemson didn't focus the offense around Trevor running the football. And you have to kind of go back to Deshaun Watson and to some degree Kelly Bryant, where the running game was really, from the quarterback position, a focal point. And I think we'll see that a little bit with DJ this year, just because of his physical presence being so big. I think it brings an element to Clemson's offense that really wasn't there with Trevor Lawrence. And again, you've got a number 1 prospect who's going to get drafted the first overall pick in the NFL. Why would you run him a whole lot in Trevor Lawrence? I understand all of that. And his body type wasn't the same as DJ. So I think you'll see one of the strengths that Clemson will bring on the offensive side of the ball will be potentially the running from the quarterback position. A couple of other, I think, strengths, and James, you can follow up and with any of these if you want. I think the defensive line for the Tigers reminds me a little bit of that 2017 team. Of course, the Power Rangers and Christian Wilkins and Cleveland Farrell and Dexter Lawrence and Austin Bryant. I think it's a little premature to kind of crown this group part 2 of that, but I think it has the potential there. Tyler Davis, who is a guy who was just a major disruptor last year. You saw Clemson defensively without him when he was out. He was banged up for most of the year. When he was in, Clemson was a different defense than when he was out, but hopefully he's back. Brian Brissy, who of course was the ACC Rookie of the Year last year on the defense. Miles Murphy, who led the Tigers in sacks as a true freshman. That's a stable core that really is unmatched in the country. And then you throw in these guys who can rotate in: KJ Henry, Justin Maskell, Xavier Thomas is, we keep waiting for him to kind of fulfill his potential. Justin Foster decided to come back after retiring from football, and now he's back at Clemson. DeMonte Capehart. It's a very talented group on the defensive line, but it's also a very deep group on that defensive line, and I think it's a game changer for the Tigers in 2021 because of that depth and because of that frontline talent. And again, Brian Bresee and Miles Murphy played as true freshmen last year. I mean, these are guys that were fresh off the boat, if you will, and they played very, very well in their time last year. The other strengths, I think, for Clemson could be that wide receiver. Well, it's definitely the wide receiver and tight end depth. You've got a lot of names there: Joseph Ngata, E.J. Williams, Braden Galloway, Azu, Frank Ladson, Davis Allen. I mean, there's just a long list of wide receivers and tight ends. I think obviously the key to that is Justin Ross back? And if he's back, is he Justin Ross? I mean, I think there's two questions there that don't yet have an answer. We won't really know. I mean, I think Dabo Swinney has who, of course, is the eternal optimist, especially when it comes to injury updates and so forth, has been very positive about Justin being cleared and being ready to go. But and A, he's got to get cleared, and then B, is he the same Justin Ross? I mean, we saw Mike Williams go through all of this with a different injury, but there's some similarities to that a couple of years ago, and he came back and he was as good as advertised right from the very beginning against Auburn on the road. The Tigers went on the road that year upon Mike Williams' return, and he was a big, big factor in that game. So we'll see if Justin's there, but there's a lot of bodies, a lot of really talented guys at that wide receiver position. And then the final thing I think that makes a major strength coming back for Clemson, and there's four of them, and this is the fourth, is the kicking game. And I think both B.T. Potter and Will Spires return. This is a kicking game that is very dependable, can be a weapon. And again, in close games, championship type games, those are guys I think that can make a difference. So I think there's certainly a lot of strengths for the Tigers coming back. I mean, there's a reason why Clemson will be ranked in the top 5 in the preseason polls when they come out. It's because they've got a lot of talent, and they've got a lot of key talent in key positions, and it's certainly enough talent to make another championship run.
There's no doubt about that. Now, let's go on the flip side of it. What are some of the major weaknesses for the Tigers, and what do you think? Next week as we kick off fall camp, what will the Tigers be looking to addressing going into that big game against Georgia?
Well, I think it starts and stops at a place that's probably pretty close to your heart, James, and that's at the offensive line. I mean, Clemson was very good, a ACC championship caliber team last year, but not a national championship caliber team. And I think a lot of it was because of the trenches. Clemson on the defensive side of the ball was really banged up for a lot of the year, didn't have a lot of depth. And then again, you had some young talent. I think the defensive line issues from the previous year correct themselves with another year of experience, more depth. You hope some of those guys don't get banged up. So I feel really good on that side of the trenches. But to win a national championship, I'm not talking about winning an ACC championship. I'm talking about winning a national championship. You've got to be great in the trenches, both sides of the ball. So if we can assume for a moment the defensive line is going to be championship caliber, and I think it will, then my attention shifts to the offensive line. And it was in the big games. And when I say big games, I'm talking the 2 Notre Dame games and, of course, Ohio State game. And really, if you look at the 2 losses that Clemson had, Clemson just couldn't run the football. And you had the best running back in probably Clemson football history, maybe ACC history, and Travis Etienne, and you just couldn't run the football. I mean, the Tigers had 34 yards rushing against Notre Dame up in South Bend, and only 44 against Ohio State in the Sugar Bowl in the semifinal. Now, some of that's due to the fact that Clemson became enamored with throwing the football with Trevor Lawrence, and I understand all that piece to it. But I think you regardless of who's playing quarterback, you're not going to win championships if you can't run the football. And Clemson's offensive line was very much a disappointment last year. It was banged up. There were some COVID issues, of course, as most teams had. But there's the hope there that that's going to get better. Jordan McFadden, Matt Bockhorst, Mason Trotter, Hunter Rayburn, Will Putnam, Walter Parks, a lot of names here, a lot of guys who are highly recruited. Clemson has recruited better on the offensive line, but many of those guys are unproven. You got some backups coming in that will play some key roles. Marcus Tate's a guy I'm keeping an eye on. John Williams as a redshirt freshman in the guard position. But Clemson's got to get better on the offensive line in order to run the football, and that's to win championships. You're not going to beat Georgia and Charlotte. You're not going to maybe win an ACC championship against whoever the Tigers play there, but you're certainly not going to win a national championship if you can't run the football, and that's going to be key in that up front. So until proven otherwise, I consider the offensive line a question mark for Clemson, and I think that parlays into my second concern or area of potential weakness, and that's running back. I mean, you don't lose your best running back in program history and not suffer a setback. I mean, that's natural. We understand that. But, there's a lot to be proven from the guys who back him up. I mean, Lynn J. Dixon's a guy who's shown, times where he's been very electric and you think, all right, here's our guy. But then there's other times he hasn't. Then Kobe Pace, maybe he's going to get in the mix here. We saw a little bit of him last year. I'm just really concerned at the running back position. We'll talk in a moment about Will Shipley, the true freshman coming in when we talk about recruits. But a lot to be proven at the running back position. And again, that can be made to look a lot better if you get good offensive line play. But look, if Travis Etienne couldn't have a great year running the football last year under the behind the offensive line that Clemson put on the field last year, there's a lot of work to be done on the offensive line, but that also brings a major concern to who backs up Travis Etienne, because we don't have another Travis Etienne, at Clemson. There is no guy on the roster that fits that mold. So, and maybe the running game comes a little bit from the quarterback position, with DJ Uiagalelei. So that'll factor into things as well. And then I think the final thing to me that's a concern, and I think there's a lot of great bodies back here, and I think there's a lot of talent. But we saw in Clemson's losses, really the secondary being lit up pretty good. I mean, Ian Book did that in November up in South Bend, and then, of course, Justin Fields just had a field day throwing the football. Ohio State threw for 385 yards. I mean, you think about Brent Venables' defense, and you just don't hear 385 passing yards come out of your vernacular. I mean, it's unheard of almost. But that's what Justin Fields threw for and made it look easy, quite frankly, in the Sugar Bowl. And then, of course, Notre Dame threw for over 300 as well up in South Bend. So I think the secondary has a lot to prove as well. But I think there's bodies there. Fred Davis, who of course has been in the news recently as well. Mario Goodrich, Sheridan Davis, Malcolm Green. There's some guys back there along with the starters who return. And we talk about Nolan Turner at the safety position, but I think there's a lot to be proven in that Clemson secondary. And again, to play championship football, you can't give up over 300 yards passing to anyone in those key games, and so it's going to need to improve in the secondary as well.
All right, Scott. Let's look at are there any new recruits or transfers? And we know Dad was not a big transfer guy, but just in case we've missed anyone, that have impressed you most during the off season, are there any that you think might get some major playing time right away?
Well, you hit on the first part of that, Jeff, and that is, Dabo's not going to at this moment. It's not a portal guy. He's not doing that. Not much on the transfers. We'll see how that plays out. I mean, the game is changing rapidly when it comes to the portal. But aside from that, Clemson will look to what I think are three guys who potentially will get on the field, but also I think with the potential with COVID protocols and contact tracing and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's possible that a lot of these freshmen will play. We saw that last year. A lot of people played because you just had to. I mean, you had guys who had to sit out or whatever. So I think depth is and I think we talked about this last year on the podcast. I think the teams that will win the most games and get to the playoffs will be the deepest teams, because they'll be able to avoid players having to sit out. And I think Clemson's a great example of that. I mean, Trevor Lawrence goes out, he misses 2 games, but DJ comes in and you win one of those 2 games without him. But if Clemson loses to Boston College, I don't know that Clemson gets in the playoff, right? And of course they lost in South Bend. So even as an ACC champion with 2 losses, I don't know that Clemson gets in. So it's that depth that you need. It's in any year, but potentially with one of the things we never thought about with football is that, when you're hurt, you can't play. But when you test positive for a virus and you have to sit out for a quarantine and you feel fine, that's just another whole world that we didn't deal with until we dealt with last year. And if we deal with that again this year, I think we'll see a lot of this freshman class play. But there's 3 guys from whom I think really to keep an eye on that will make an immediate impact. And it starts with Will Shipley, the 5-star from Matthews, North Carolina, kind of the running back, could play in the slot, can kind of do a lot of things. He's wowed people in the spring. To hear his teammates talk about him, they are very, very high on him. I don't know that I've heard of that kind of buzz from the running back position in a long time, because keep in mind, Travis Etienne kind of was under the radar when he came in. Same with Wayne Gallman. And so it's been a long time since Clemson has recruited a running back that has caused a stir. And Will Shipley has caused a stir. Now, we'll see when the live bullets start happening, and can he do the things in pass protection and some of the other things that you've got to be able to do to get on the field week 1 against another top 5 team in Georgia up in Charlotte. So I don't know that. I withhold my judgment on Will until we get through fall camp and the grind of fall camp. But as far as spring is concerned, as far as just talent, he's a guy to certainly keep an eye on. I think that Christian McCaffrey references will certainly be out there with him. But he's a guy that I think can make an impact, A, because I think the talent's there, but B, I think there's a crack in the door, an opening, if you will, for someone to step up in that running back position and be dependable. So keep an eye on Will Shipley. I also like Christian Lee, another 5-star from Virginia as an offensive tackle. He's physically, from a size standpoint, 6'5", a little underweight for, college, major college play at 270. But, keep in mind, Mitch Hyatt came in as a true freshman and played the left tackle position on a national championship team for the Tigers. So, I mean, it has been done before. I think Christian Lee is a guy that certainly fits that bill from a physical standpoint. And then the other place I think that you might see one of these signees come in is Barrett Carter, another 5-star from Suwanee, Georgia, at the linebacker position, 6'1", 220. Now, here's the negative. He didn't get to come in the spring. He didn't go through spring ball. He finished out his high school career, so he'll just come onto campus in the next week or so. But if there's the versatility, the athleticism that he brings to the linebacking position is something that I think Clemson needs. I mean, if you listen to the Tiger pregame show, leading up to some of the key games, you heard about my reverence for James Skalski and the linebacker play, but you heard me say the limitations of that sometimes, of playing in space and the athleticism that you need to play in space in this dynamic 2021 offensive game where people run all kinds of wide receivers at you and so forth. And so Skalski's very good. I mean, he's exceptional. I'm glad to have him back as a 6th year, one of these 6-year seniors, but having more athleticism there in key moments against matchup situations, especially when you're playing championship football, a guy like Barrett Carter could come in and do that. So if you ask me today, before they all get here and go through fall camp, I think Shipley and Tristan Lee and Barrett Carter are the three guys to keep an eye on that will see significant time, but also will fit the role of a need as opposed to just gathering the minutes. It's something that I think Clemson really needs these three guys to be good at what they do in year one.
All right. Scott, do you think that Clemson will be better than last year? Why or why not? And then we're going to play, and I always got to give credit where we first heard of this idea. We call it win game, lose game. And when we got this idea from Mickey Plyer's morning show on 105.5, when he calls it his win game show. So, kind of give him credit where we first came up with this. And we'll go through Clemson's schedule and get your feeling on whether that game is going to be a win or a loss.
Looking forward to doing that, and I'm sure Mickey appreciates the kind words. I think it's pretty simple. If Clemson's going to be better, and again, here's the ceiling. The ceiling is, you were one of the top four teams last year. So the only way to improve is either to make the national championship or to win it. So there's not a lot to gain there, right? I mean, Clemson's kind of an elite area, but to me, it's in the trenches. I mean, I think Clemson was not able to win a national championship last year because the offensive line and the defensive line, primarily the offensive line, but then as the season wore on, the defensive line just couldn't stand up to championship caliber football. So if you told me today, and I think, again, as I said earlier, I think defensive line Clemson's better this year than they were last year. I don't know about offensive line. I'm the jury's still out in the Scott Reimer world when it comes to the offensive line. But if you told me now that both would be better, the defensive line would play better in the big games and the offensive line would play better in the big games. And I absolutely believe Clemson's a national championship contender this year. I think without the offensive line play, I think Clemson's certainly in the midst for an ACC championship and a college football playoff berth. But I don't think you can win championships. And I think this has been proven through the years even in the playoff era, when you look at the teams that have won national championships, it's been the teams that have been great in a lot of areas, great quarterback play, great wide receivers, great cornerbacks. There's been a lot of great players in a lot of different positions, but I don't think anybody's won a national championship in a long, long time that hasn't been great on the offensive line and the defensive line. And so Clemson's got to get better there. And if they do, they're a championship team. If they don't, they're on the periphery. They're right there, but I don't think they can win it all without a great offensive line performance.
All right, and we're going to find out, I think, right away about Clemson and Georgia in that first game of the season. I think most media members out there, most fans across the country are calling this the regular season game of the year. Charlotte, North Carolina, right off the bat, playing historical rival Georgia and Clemson.
Yeah, I think what a great opening to the season, and this will probably get more attention than most of the games on the schedule as we go through this win game. But here's the thing: when I look at this game pre-fall practice, I think there's two things that jump out to me. I think number one is I think Georgia has a motivational edge in this game. Georgia is kind of the Clemson of 4 or 5 years ago, trying to establish themselves as a power. I know Georgia made the national championship game a couple of years ago and lost in heartbreaking fashion to Alabama on that throw by Tua late in the game. But Georgia's still trying to get there, right? They haven't won a national championship since the 1980 season. So I think they see this game as that proving ground, if you will, much like Clemson did, 4 or 5 years ago when Clemson was trying to prove that they deserved to be in consideration for a national championship. So I think the emotional motivation, the intangibles, if you will, of the game reside with Georgia. From the Clemson side, it's all about, to me, at this moment, Justin Ross. Is he going to be healthy and can he play? And then if he can play, can he be Justin Ross? Can he be the Justin Ross of the Alabama game out in Santa Clara? Because if that's yes, if you told me now that it's going to be Justin's going to be Justin and it's going to be Santa Clara and whether, they're going to have to, Georgia's going to have to throw all their resources to stop him, which just open up the floodgates for a bunch of other wide receivers for Clemson in the running game as well. Then I like Clemson's chances. But I don't know. I don't know that we'll know that prior to Georgia. So, you're putting me in a tough spot here because I'm a Clemson guy, but I just can't shake the feeling that Georgia's going to find a way to win a very, very close game in Charlotte week 1, and that will position Georgia very well, and it won't eliminate Clemson, as we'll find out as we go through the rest of these games.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there's any doubt that that's the toughest game on Clemson's schedule, probably by a touchdown when it comes out to the the odds makers. So I think as we go through this schedule, we're about to find out where Clemson ends up after that game. So the next week after playing the Georgia Bulldogs, then they come back home and play the SC State Bulldogs.
Yeah, pretty easy conversation there, although I will give a plug to South Carolina State. Wonderful band, the greatest halftime show that you'll ever see. So if you've seen it before or if you haven't seen it, stay in at Death Valley to watch an amazing band for South Carolina State. But Clemson wins that one easily.
All right. Then you stay at home and you're playing another team from Georgia. Not the same caliber as Georgia Bulldogs, but it's the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, who are trying to work themselves back into relevance under Jeff Collins.
Yeah, I like Coach Collins. I think Georgia Tech's headed in the right direction, but they're not there yet, and that will be easy pickings for the Tigers as well. So that's 2 easy and big wins in week 2 and 3.
All right, and now I think this is kind of a critical 2-game stretch here, because I think these are the 2 next best teams on Clemson's schedule, and maybe nationally people aren't really going to pay that close of attention, but within the ACC, these next 2 games are against some pretty solid teams, and you go on the road after Georgia Tech, you play at NC State, and they've got some talent on that NC State team.
Yeah, you touched on it, Jeff, and I'd kind of in my mind thought that this was kind of going to be the focal point of this win game. It's a 2-week stretch. I think Clemson's going to be a fourth quarter game, if not both of the games, certainly one of them. I think this is the type of week 2. Let's see, this will be week 3, 4, I guess, games that can kind of define a season, especially if Clemson were to lose to Georgia in Charlotte, because the margin of error just decreases so much. The trip to Raleigh is always difficult. I mean, I know Clemson has had some big games, big wins there. I think the last time Clemson played in Raleigh, it was a relatively easy win. But the vast majority of times going to Raleigh, those are fans that get into the game. I think NC State's a good football team. I think they're a top 25 football team, and I think when you get a top 25 football team and you go on the road, you've got to play well to win that game. So, and then you mentioned the next week, on October 2nd, you move into October with Boston College at home. And, Boston College gave Clemson everything they wanted and then some in Death Valley last year. So those 2 games, I think, will define Clemson's season more so than the Georgia game in week 1. And I definitely think one of those 2 games will be a fourth quarter war, kind of just, who can make the plays down the stretch. And so Clemson, and maybe both those games will be that, but I think certainly one of them will be. I think Clemson wins both of those. But I think if you're looking at Clemson's schedule and you got a lot of youth playing in key positions, you got to get to October 2nd with only one loss, whether that's to Georgia or either NC State or Boston College, and feel pretty good about your college football playoff experience, because there's a possibility there, at least from a scheduling standpoint, that you could have 2 losses by October 2nd, which would be gosh, we'd have to go back to the history books. I don't know how long it's been since Clemson had 2 losses before October 2nd, but it is a front-loaded schedule. I think both of those games are going to be dogfights.
All right. So after that first 5 games here, Clemson gets a much needed bye week. That's like you said, that could be 3 top 25 teams you're playing in the first 5 weeks of the season potentially. So off week after Boston College, then you go on the road, and you play at a place on a Friday night that's been trouble in the past for Clemson. But I'm not sure if this Syracuse team is equipped to really push Clemson.
It has been a problem for Clemson. You're right. I don't see it here. I think the Friday night thing, that doesn't play as much of a factor to me as just Dino Babers and Syracuse having some good football teams and some quarterbacks that could do some things that really hurt Clemson. I don't see this as that kind of game. I think Clemson's significantly better than Syracuse at this point, and I think the Tigers come away pretty easily there.
All right. After Syracuse, you go on the road. You play at Pitt. They got their returning quarterback Pickett. Who's got some NFL buzz around him, but that Pitt team's lost a lot of talent off their team from last year.
Yeah, it's a game that 2 or 3 years ago when I saw we were going up to Pitt. I looked forward to it because that's a new venue for Clemson to play in, and for Clemson fans to visit, and you kind of respect. Pitt beat the first year Clemson won, or the second year Clemson won a national championship after 1981. Of course, Pitt beat Clemson in Death Valley, and so you kind of had this nostalgia that Pitt, is kind of a Tiger Slayer, if you will. But that really hasn't proven to be the case when you look at the other games that the Tigers have played against Pittsburgh. So I agree with you. Pitt's lost a lot of talent. Good quarterback, but I think the Tigers get that win.
All right. Then you come back home and host the Florida State Seminoles.
Yeah, what an interesting team. I mean, they just have fallen so far that they don't fall on the radar. When you look at the schedule, and I followed Clemson, and you always looked at Florida State and you thought, it's going to be a tough one, whether you're down in Tallahassee or at Clemson, and you just don't get that feel anymore. It's just not a team that scares you. I think Florida State's better this year. I think there's a lot of rebuilding still to be done. Tigers win big in that one.
All right. After Florida State, you go on the road, you play at Louisville.
Yeah, again, Louisville, very well coached, and I think there's, the upside of Louisville is there. I just, again, think you just look at the roster, you just don't see a whole lot of guys that could stand out, and when you match up talent to talent against a team like Clemson, I just think they're in over their head. I could see this game being one of those first half games where it's, interesting and so forth, but I think Clemson pulls away at the end, pulls away in the second half. Again, I just think the talent discrepancy between Clemson and Louisville is such that you're not going to see an upset happen up there.
All right, then Clemson comes back home and they host the Connecticut Huskies, and this one could get real ugly.
Yeah, I wonder, and I haven't looked at the schedule yet. That could be Military Appreciation Day. It could be kind of a significant day for Clemson. But yeah, UConn comes onto the schedule late in the year. If this were women's basketball, a little bit of trouble. But I think football, we got this thing under control.
Yeah. Then you stay at home and you host the Wake Forest Demon Deacons.
Yeah, Wake Forest, again, another team that, you have a lot of respect for what they do, considering the limitations they have, but not something that late in the year. I think one of the things about the post-October 2nd schedule for all these teams in the ACC, and I know we're about to get to South Carolina in a moment, but, if you're going to get Clemson, I think you get Clemson early because of some of the youth and some of the positions that the Tigers will have. By November, late November, unless there's just major injuries and so forth, I think Clemson will be humming pretty good. If Clemson is still in the midst of the college football playoff hunt, which I think we will be, I just don't see a mental letdown there. I think the mental letdowns happen when you're out of the playoff hunt and you're fighting for bowl priority, so to speak. So I think Wake Forest again will run into a team that's motivated, probably an Orange Bridge game. It's you're clinching ACC title, Atlantic Division kind of game. There's that motivational edge that you don't want to play Clemson late in the year unless Clemson's out of contention. You really want to play Clemson earlier in the year to have a chance. So I think Wake Forest is again another team that's just not talented enough to beat Clemson.
All right, and then you finish on the road in Columbia against arch rival South Carolina.
Yeah, renewing the rivalry. We had to sit out a year from that, which was really disappointing, and that it is what it is, and we'll leave it at that. I'll steal a Steve Spurrier comment on that, but it is what it is. Very disappointing not to be able to play that game last year. But I like the Beamer hire. I think South Carolina's done the right thing in that hire. But the rebuilding job there is pretty significant, and the Gamecocks will not be in a position this year to challenge Clemson or slow Clemson down. But I do think if again, as I don't wish anything great upon the University of South Carolina in terms of their success, so to speak. But I do think the hire's a good one. And we'll see. I think the Muschamp hire was just not a good move for the Gamecocks, but I think they're on the right path. But it won't be this year. The Gamecocks are still several years away from competing against the Tigers.
All right, Scott, give us the pulse of the Clemson football program. What are Clemson bloggers and fans thinking? Right now on the status of the program, and as part of this question, what's the feeling around Clemson? Following the expansion moves by the SEC with Oklahoma and Texas, Paul Feinbaum earlier said in the week that he thought that move hurt the Clemson brand. I'm not sure how he came to that conclusion, but that is what he said.
It is what he said. The landscape is changing so quickly. It's hard. We're on August 1st right now. So, this will go down for posterity forever and ever and ever. And somebody could rewind this thing and say, well, see how foolish that thought was, and back on August 1st, 2021. The first thing is, your first part of the question was about what Clemson's mentality is. Until Clemson does not consistently make the playoffs, it's all about championships, national championships for Clemson. I think there was a disappointment last year. I think everybody understood that last year was kind of wonky, and it was what it was. But you make the playoffs, and you had a chance for a championship, and you just didn't get it. You got an ACC championship, and those will always be important as long as Clemson's in the ACC. So it was a good year, not a great year. You rewind 15 years, and it would have been a great year, not even a good year, right? I mean, because the dynamics have shifted of what defines a great year now for Clemson. So I think you expect to compete for a national championship. I think Clemson has a national championship roster. Things have to fall into place. You have to do some things to make all that happen. But I think Clemson should be in consideration for that. So until that world ends, until Clemson goes 2 or 3 or 4 years without making the playoffs or not winning double-digit games, I mean, that's going to be the mentality of the Clemson Nation is to win another national championship, which would be your fourth. Certainly the landscape of college football is moving. I mean, I don't whether you fall on what's happening now is going to be cataclysmic or whether it's going to be seismic in the changes that are coming. It is changing. I mean, in rapid time frame. In terms of Clemson itself, right now in 2021, it doesn't really matter. Clemson's a very relevant player on the stage, and talent-wise is a major player on the stage. So it doesn't matter if Clemson, if the SEC expands and the ACC doesn't, or, all that doesn't matter. I do see where Paul Feinbaum, I can see where he's going with that in terms of the long view of this. And, if, right now Clemson's on top of the world in terms of people want to play for Clemson. It's a dynamic brand. It's a high-quality product. But that's not going to last forever. I mean, there's a laundry list of teams that have been on top of the world who have fallen off, including teams that have made it back to the top of the world. I mean, Alabama was their premier program, many, many years ago and fell off and then came back. There will be a time when Clemson falls off being a major influencer of college football. So when that time comes, if you're in a conference from which is quote unquote irrelevant, then that becomes a problem for you, right? And so today it doesn't matter. Probably 2 years from now, it's not going to matter. But 20 years from now or 10 years from now, maybe it will. So I think all this expansion, I think Clemson will be involved in it. I think Clemson's a marketable enough program to where people are going to want Clemson a part of it, whether it's the ACC expanding out or whether it's the SEC, taking over the world, if you will. I don't think Clemson's going to be left out of that. I think there's some teams that could be. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to be a mediocre team, a.k.a. Clemson 1994, 1995, 1996, that era, where you're really not a player on the national scene and nobody really wants you on the national scene. You don't want to be in that spot when all these changes happen. So I think it's a very interesting time. I think Clemson's in fine shape right now, but I also can see Paul Feinbaum's stance that, in the long view of this, if the SEC takes over the world, Clemson better be a part of the SEC, I guess, if that's the end game of all of this.
And I think that's a really good point that you brought up about, especially with Clemson as an example of where they were in the 90s. Because, if we are going to go in a direction, and I personally don't think it'll end up this way, but, I mean, I think it's a real enough possibility that where to think about it, if college football becomes the top 32 brands in the top 32 college football brands out there that, either peel off onto a super conference SEC or some other group of 32, you've taken away that ability for teams to rise and fall. If this had happened in 1999, would Clemson have been included? I don't know. Nebraska certainly would have, but would you include Nebraska now? Maybe not. Probably not. They're just a brand name. They're not a brand anymore. So I think that direction we have to be careful of, that you don't get so exclusionary, because, upward and downward mobility can happen, and it has happened, very recently. But like you said, we just have to see what the landscape looks like in the next 10 years or so.
I think that's a great point, and I think you have to kind of keep in mind here, too. Let's just take Clemson, for example. Clemson became a lot more relevant in the mid, 2011, 12, 13, somewhere around in there. Because Clemson was kind of winning that 10 games, but Clemson still hadn't won anything significant. I mean, I guess the ACC championship of 2011, that's significant at the time. But, it wasn't until 2015, that's what, 7 years ago? I mean, it was 6 years ago now. I mean, this isn't like this has been going on forever, and so your point is very valid. Had the landscape of college football been different than what it was when Dabo Swinney took the helm, could Clemson have ascended that mountain? Would the landscape have allowed that to happen? And I'd like to think that whatever we do in the future, it would allow for that But certainly in this landscape, it did, because we saw this resurrection, and I think the Nebraska example is a wonderful example of how a team can fall off the face of the earth. And look, Florida State's a great example. I mean, but 1999, who would have taken at that moment, 20 the 15-year look at it and said, I'll take Clemson over Florida State when you saw the 1998 season? Well, very few people probably. I mean, most people would have taken Florida State, and bet the money on that. And of course that hasn't been the case if you look at the history. So yeah, you hope that teams would be able to ebb and flow their way into it, but it's certainly a dynamic time. And some of that's exciting, but some of that is a little worrisome. But I think in all of it, you can't control the things you can't control. And so Clemson can control Clemson, and Dabo Swinney can control his program. And I think that's where the focus has to remain, and let the other people deal with all the other stuff that goes here and there. And you just go about producing a great product. And I think if you continue to produce a great product, you'll be fine no matter what the landscape of college football looks like.
All right, very good. James, I'm going to turn it over to you for our last couple of questions on the podcast.
All right. Well, as we start wrapping up, assuming that Clemson can navigate that 2-game stretch at the end of September and the beginning of October, who do you think the Tigers could face in the ACC title game in Charlotte?
Well, I think, James, it's a great battle in the Coastal Division that's about to take place between Miami and North Carolina. I think both teams and both programs feel like they're on the upside. I think a lot of people think North Carolina is a little bit ahead of Miami on the upside. But, when you look at the scheduling of this, and I think when you're not an elite team, and I don't think Miami nor North Carolina are elite, you need some favors in the scheduling, and Clemson was there. I mean, you'll recall that in those years prior to getting to the college football playoff, you kind of had to get that favorable schedule in order to make the run. Well, both Miami and North Carolina have that favorable schedule. They both avoid Clemson and Boston College in the regular season, which I think are the two best teams in the Atlantic Division. So that's a wash. We'll walk that one off. Then Miami Miami has Virginia Tech at home, and North Carolina has to travel to Blacksburg. So I think that's an advantage for Miami in that respect. Miami also hosts North Carolina State. North Carolina has to travel to Raleigh, and I think NC State teams are the second or third best team in the Atlantic Division. So when you look at the top teams in their cross-divisional games, I think the advantage goes to Miami as far as scheduling is concerned. But then on the flip side of that, kind of weighing against that, is North Carolina gets to host Miami in that big October 16th game. And by the way, Miami gets the bye week prior to that game. So Miami has the bye week. North Carolina hosts it in Chapel Hill. So, I think there's some scheduling advantages. Even though Miami has to go to North Carolina, I think the scheduling advantages favor Miami just a little bit in between these two teams by not going to Raleigh and by not going to Blacksburg. So I think, and then I think North Carolina is just maybe a hair better than Miami. So this whole thing's a wash to me. North Carolina's a little bit better team. Miami has a better scheduling. So I think this is a fascinating matchup on the other side of the division. But my gut still tells me North Carolina will be in Charlotte because they'll win the game in Chapel Hill versus Miami. And I just think that's going to be the de facto tiebreaker. I think both teams will have regular season ACC losses outside of that game. And so it wouldn't surprise me North Carolina loses a game along the way. but beats Miami, and that beating of Miami gets the tiebreaker to allow for the Tar Heels. Now, August 1st, I'm taking the Tar Heels, but I love this is going to be a fascinating matchup on the Coastal Division, and I think either team, when it's all said and done, I think either team could be there in Charlotte.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. I'm fascinated to see what D'Eriq King looks like coming off that injury, and if he can capture that same magic that he had at different points last year. So it definitely should be interesting. But as we wrap up, it's open mic time, and what do you have for us, Scott?
Well, I think just excited about the football season. I think the thing I would lay out on the table here for you guys to ponder, obviously the blue bloods of college football have and will work through last year from a financial standpoint and all that with COVID. But even if this year ends up being a little bumpy, I think the blue bloods will make it through it. The Clemsons, the Ohio States, the Alabamas. I wonder in sports in general, and certainly college football specifically, is whether if things go a little bumpy this year, whether the marginal teams can survive. A lot of people stayed at home last year and found that to not be such a bad deal. I mean, you pay a lot of money to go see Wake Forest. If you're a Wake Forest fan, you pay a lot of money to do season tickets and to go to the games and pay for all that kind of stuff. And you thought, well, watch it on TV wasn't so bad. It wasn't that big of a deal to watch it on TV. So I do wonder where live sports, whether and specifically college football, because that's what we're talking about tonight, can withstand from a marginal level, the people, not the programs that live and breathe it, but the programs that can do with it or do without it, whether those folks come back, and whether or not the value of coming to games is still there for the Wake Forest of the world and for the Virginias of the world and so forth. So to me, that's a fascinating watch. I don't know whether we're going to deal with COVID in the fall here, and if that's the case, it may be 2022 before we can really autopsy, if you will, the impacts of all of this. But to me, I just felt like, as a personal fan, I went to all the games last year in Clemson, but I didn't go to all the away games last year. But even I kind of saw, well, I talked to many friends who thought, watching them on TV is not such a bad deal. I mean, it's very available to do. So I would hope that the value of being in Death Valley, being in Doak Campbell, being in Williams-Brice Stadium or, wherever, the value of being in person still will exist beyond this pandemic, and that we don't as a mass group of people, we don't lose that value, and I think that's still to be determined. We just don't know if that will be the case. I certainly hope it will, because I love college football and I love the pageantry of college football, and I think part of that pageantry is people in the stands, and so I sure hope we can move past this and people still crave to be there in person and not sitting in front of a 56-inch HD TV. I mean, that's my hope, but maybe I'm just being a little nostalgic and reminiscent of the old days.
All right. For my open mic, they had in the summertime the 12-team playoff proposal that the college athletic administrators were going to look at in September, and after what Greg Sankey, the SEC, Oklahoma, and Texas pulled off in the last week here, I expect that the playoff proposal for 12 teams, and you've already seen this from the Pac-12 commissioner, is something that's going to get put on pause. There was some discussion that the new playoff format could be in effect as early as 2023. I don't expect that now, and what I do expect is you're going to see a more aligned Pac-12, Big Ten, and ACC. It's what I expect, and to have some pushback on this really open-ended virtual SEC invitational playoff tournament where if with Oklahoma and Texas, the SEC is probably looking at it anywhere from 3 to 6 teams a year making the playoffs. I think you may see things like a harder push for auto bids for the now Power 4 conferences. I'm not sure if you can really include the Big 12 as a Power 5 conference anymore. I mean, they still have some good teams and good brands in there, but they're now an 8-team conference. And I think this is going to take some time. I think there's going to be a pause on it, and whatever outcome comes from this, I really would like to see, the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the ACC, kind of form a little block again. Anything that the SEC is trying to do and try to build in, some equity into this playoff. I'm not sure. One of the discussions has been maybe capping the number of teams that are in the playoffs. I'm not sure if that's going to completely fly or even if I personally agree with it, but I think one of the things they can do is, for a high enough ranked team, maybe a top 12, top 15 team from a Power 4 conference, to have that team have an auto bid and an auto buy through the playoffs so that, 1 through 4 champion, from one of those 4 SEC, Big 12, or not Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and Big 10, get a bye through that first week of the playoffs. So, I think we have to see what's going on. Something that looked like a done deal virtually this summer, I think it's gotten kind of derailed from what the SEC moved, and I'd like to see the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, the ACC work together on this. So we'll just have to see how that works out. James, do you have any open mic topics, or Scott, any additional thoughts?
Sure. I'll just want to kind of piggyback off of what Scott talked about, and I just hope the leaders, it hasn't. We talked before we went live. Scott and I were talking about how it hadn't been a really good week in regards to the news, in regards to the virus, and I'm just hopeful that we can get through this season and get through it with fans. Like Scott, I missed one home game last year, and it was just so different. And I just hope that we can get to Charlotte, especially, and have it in front of 70,000 fans, because I was in Charlotte for the Notre Dame game last year, and I just couldn't help think. I know the circumstances wouldn't have presented it, but just could you imagine the energy in a rematch with a full stadium in Charlotte? And I just think that's the thing that makes college football so special, are the crowds and the different venues. And so I hope we can get that. I'm excited about what's ahead, and man, I think there's just I think it's going to be a good year for the ACC. And I'm not an ACC flag waver, but I think with all the quarterbacks returning in the conference, I think that's gonna make a difference, and hopefully some of these teams can not just play well against Clemson, but play well throughout the year and be in the top 15, maybe push the top 10, and just create some buzz. And I think we have the quarterback play in the conference to do that this year. But appreciate everybody and the opportunity.
All right. Well, James, thanks for coming on. Oh, Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, no, most certainly. Thanks for having me on, and thanks, James. It's great to hear from you, and it's always a pleasure to be on. And we'll crank this thing up again a year from now, and let's have a great college football season. I think I echo James' optimism. I think it's coming.
All right, Scott. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast. James, thanks for taking the time and filling in for Matthew this week. And you guys, everyone out there, have a great week.
Gym sessions and sweaty summer activities are back, which means more funky smells in your clothes because sweat leaves behind bacteria that causes those hard-to-remove odors. Clorox fabric sanitizer products are ready to zap the stink out of fabrics in your home by getting rid of 99.9% of odor-causing bacteria. Eliminate odors in every load or sanitize fabrics between washes with one of our fabric sanitizer products. Search fabric sanitizer at Clorox.com to learn more. When it counts, trust Clorox. Use as directed.